We see your power, we see your resistance, we see you and acknowledge our role as settlers to these lands. I speak before you one day after NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was kicked out of the Federal House of Commons for calling a Bloc Québécois MP a racist. In the always apt words of Harsha Walia, quote, refuse the white gaze. This story is about racist MP Alain Tarrant. Name him. Name that he voted against a motion on racism in RCMP, which is a matter of fact and historical record. Name the racism that Singh, a visible Sikh, is being subjected to, end quote. This is because since its colonial inceptions and foundations, Canada or Turtle Island, there's a negation of our racist past, which informs the negation of our racist present. We call ourselves the land of the free for Black slaves in America, completely ignoring the history of African slavery in this country. We call ourselves a multicultural nation, which has fueled the ammunition for all racist organizations, media, museums, universities, businesses, and corporations to continue to perpetuate their white supremacy through equity and diversity tropes. There's a worldwide shift that is happening, and it's not about inclusion, it's about dismantling structures. I'm really excited about this panel today because they offer incredible experience, depth, knowledge around issues of racism, both within their professional sectors and within their lived experiences. The panel today is to ignite a movement towards an anti-racist revolution. And if you're listening today, reflect on what your role will be in that revolution. We also want to recognize that this panel is not wholly representative and that an Indigenous voice is not included. And as we move forward, we will do better next time. And we do apologize. This panel planning began 3 months ago in March, actually, when we originally were going to do a panel about South Asians and media to align with the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And then COVID happened. And then we decided to reignite the panel to talk about anti-Asian racism during the time of COVID. And then Black Lives Matter happened 2 weeks ago. And so we've been adapting our panel to make it as current as possible. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Joanne Shu, I think, is running late or she's unable to join at this time. So we're hoping she's able to join us soon. But we're going to start anyways with our panelists. We're keeping it very simple, asking 2 questions to each of the panelists. And it's going to be a conversation amongst each other, really. And then there is a Q&A that is being moderated, as I said, by Anita and Ian. And so we'll be answering questions at the end. So our panelists today, first is Junie Desil. Junie is a poet born of immigrant Haitian parents on the traditional territories of the Kanien'kehá in the island known as Tiohtià or Montreal, raised in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. Junie has performed at various literary events and festivals, and her work has appeared in Room Magazine, PRISM International, the Capilano Review, and CV2. Jagdish Maan is a Jack Webster Award-winning journalist and media professional based in Vancouver. For a decade, he was a partner and executive director in a media startup that published the Asian Pacific Post and South Asian Post, independent weeklies serving Vancouver's multicultural communities. Mo Dhaliwal, Mo's dedication to cross-cultural understanding through the arts has taken many forms over the decades. From curating events, designing exhibits, and hosting dialogues to publicly speak out against experiences of discrimination, Mo strives to draw attention to the hard topics as a way of making change. Thank you so much, panelists, for being here, and we hope that Joanna can join us soon. I'd like to start with my first question. It's a broad one, and I'm asking each of you to reflect on what racism looks like locally according to your professional and personal experiences. So what does racism look like locally according to your professional and personal experiences? No, Mo, do you want to start? I think Junie's having issues.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So locally, according to my professional and personal experience, professionally, I don't think there's necessarily been a lot of overlap in my day job, running a creative agency. I can maybe speak to experiences as a vendor, on the odd occasion, where, there's been a few meetings where I've been complimented on my English in the last 8 years, which, maybe that's not too much. and then there was at least one occasion where there was, disbelief that I'd be able to understand some concept, rooted in Western European branding because of my upbringing and who I am. My personal experiences are a little bit different. This is obviously, based on growing up in a small town, just an hour east of here in Abbotsford, of encountering racism, but also being kind of, complicit in a lot of it. I think back to my early school days in elementary, going to Margaret Stenderson Elementary School and being, I think the only brown kid in my division and definitely the only brown kid in my neighborhood. And still kind of joining in when, really, really racist language was used to describe Black people and the First Nations communities, right? And that probably, I think, carried on up until like the second or third grade. And I think it was by the time I got to my third grade that then some teachers would kind of hear the kids talking and would kind of wag their finger at you a little bit, but not really. And it wasn't until later in life that I actually myself realized that, these epithets that we were using to describe these communities, like how damaging and how horrible they were. So, I think the experience personally of racism, was definitely, throughout school and a little bit in professional life. But also the idea of kind of being a part of it and, almost being included into a group, and within that group, knowing who in the community you were actually allowed to abuse, right? And who in the community you were actually allowed to oppress. And that was kind of, that was okay. So, I think that's been my experience to date. Beyond that, there's, obviously an incident at Global BC that a lot of people heard about, where, we got into it with their news director over, one of our mainstream media outlets refusing to recognize that they had some, structural racism issues, within their own environment. And I think that kind of, carries on, right? There's been other incidents where you interact with, whether it's policing or some other institution, and you have an experience that is, and from every reading of it, you can tell is entirely, racist and wrong and prejudicial. And there's this weird denial and almost kind of, anger and kind of resentment, pointed at you for bringing this to light. And that's come up professionally, I think, quite repeatedly. Yeah.
Okay. Jagdish, did you want to speak professionally and personally, kind of your experiences? You're on mute, Jagdish.
Personally, I could certainly attest to some of those experiences that Mo talked about. Having grown up in this country, you will experience racism at an individual level. It's quite common. And at a professional level, there is also, again, sort of in the media world where I work as a journalist. There's been a number of moments where I guess, you're experiencing what I guess we call institutional racism, and you're watching this happen in front of your eyes, and it's sort of a moment of disbelief. Like, is this actually happening to me? For me, like a lot of those moments were in terms of how communities were covered. How mainstream newsrooms, which tended to be predominantly white, even back 20 years ago when I first started in the industry, and even today, continuing on 2 decades later, their perspectives and their understanding of diverse communities tended to be very narrow. It's maybe a little wider today than it once was, but there's still sort of a thinness to a lot of that reporting, and so that was always a source of frustration for me. And in the startup that I worked in, I can here's one experience which talks about systemic racism. We were about 3 or 4 years into our startup, we were looking to place news boxes in the city and in the downtown core of Vancouver in particular. And we were constantly being blocked by a couple of city officials. And they were blocking us consistently because they kept arguing to us that even though our publication was in English and it was accessible to a broad audience, that it was too culturally niche or specific to actually be permitted to place in a downtown venue. And it was couched in certain types of soft language, but the nuance was quite clear that because this was an Asian publication and because this is a Western Canadian city, your publication is not going to be permitted to be placing news boxes in the downtown core. And it took a great deal of struggle a great deal of fighting to win that battle. I think it took us about 2 years to overcome that hill. And I mean, we weren't surprised by it, but then again, I was still a little bit shocked to see the amount of resistance to that idea, and particularly in the country which values free press. So, that was definitely one incident that, caught my attention.
And when was this, Jagdish? How many years ago was this?
Well, the Newsbox incident probably goes back about 15 years. So, okay. But 3 or 4 years just prior to the economic meltdown in 2008, around that time. Okay. But the issues of media diversity and how stories are covered, or how different communities are covered, I think that still persists to this day. And I mean, you'll find fewer examples of it, I believe, now, but you'll still see. I mean, a perfect example of that would be when Jagmeet Singh won the NDP leadership, and he was interviewed on CBC by their veteran reporter, Terry Molesky. And I thought that Molesky sandbagged Jagmeet with questions about Khalistan or about his willingness to forgive the beliefs of other Sikhs, about how they viewed a couple of Sikh separatist figures from back in the 80s. And I mean, it really had nothing to do with Jagmeet Singh's policies, had nothing to do with what he was talking about at the moment. But because he happened to be Sikh, and because he wore a turban, and because he has a beard, it was almost permissible to ask those questions, at least in Molesky's viewpoint. And I thought that was problematic, and I wrote a column against that. And I think a lot of other people were also outraged by that particular incident. And that just goes back about 2 years, so it's not like this doesn't still occur.
Right. Thank you. Just want to acknowledge Joanna and Junie have been able to join us, pending no more technical difficulties. Hi, Joanna. Welcome.
Hi. Sorry about the delay.
That's okay.
Camera wouldn't turn on.
So we're just on our first question, ladies, which is, what does racism look like locally according to your professional and personal experiences? So maybe Joanna, if you can go first.
Sure. So I grew up in Vancouver. My family immigrated from Hong Kong when I was just a toddler. Well, actually, my great-grandfather first came to Vancouver as a construction worker. He was one of the thousands of Chinese men who came to help build Canada, literally, and connect Canada on the railway. But he wasn't able to stay because when we talk about systemic racism, it happened right from the start, where 100 years ago, there was an exclusionary head tax. So every Chinese person, only Chinese people, had to pay a very large amount just to enter Canada. So that's why my family didn't end up being a multi-generational Canadian family. It ended up being, we had a double immigrant situation where my grandfather had to leave because of racism. And then my parents came again and experienced racism as I was growing up. So I just remember like subtle things growing up, like my parents, because they had an accent and didn't know all of the Canadian rules, such as in restaurants, people would be impatient or kind of speak down to them. And it seemed as I got older, it got worse and worse. I actually, as a journalist, I started working in Asia first after I got my degree. So for all of my 20s, basically, I was away from Canada. I would only come back once, maybe twice a year. And I would kind of see things incrementally shift to my kind of horror sometimes. I saw this subtle racism that was present when I was growing up come more and more overt against Chinese people. A lot of it in Vancouver, also in Toronto, was a debate over foreign home ownership, where there was a lot of scapegoating when prices, the whole city in Vancouver, Toronto, these big Canadian cities became more and more expensive. There was a multitude of reasons, but a lot of the main reason people seem to latch onto was, oh, we see a lot more Chinese people come. So a lot of them have a lot of money, they drive fancy cars, it must be only their fault. And it's complicated because it's partially foreign ownership does play a role in unaffordability. But I saw people like me who just happen to look Asian become the scapegoats of this rising dissatisfaction with growing inequality in Canada. So East Asians, people wouldn't check if you were a Chinese immigrant first. If you look East Asian, you would get comments, people would think of you as an outsider. So every time I visited home from working abroad in Beijing and Hong Kong, increasingly I would get people saying things like, oh, wow, your English is pretty good, or how is that the case, or where are you from? Or they would say weird things to my partner who looks white. He's actually part Chinese, saying, "Oh, where did you find her in China?" As if he kind of like found his Chinese bride. Like a lot of really increasingly uttering type of comments where people who look Chinese weren't perceived to be Canadian. So we saw this play out more and more. And I think it hit a high point during the coronavirus pandemic, which is ongoing, where you saw across the country a lot of it. It wasn't just verbal anymore. It was a spate of violent attacks on East Asians, including what really got to me was an elderly man, 93 years old. He was in a convenience store and this big beefy guy shouted things at him related to coronavirus, saying like, "You brought it here," a lot of comments like this. And then outside the store, pushed this elderly man with dementia onto the ground. He hit his head. So as a reporter for the Toronto Star, I reported on these cases one after the other, and there was definitely a pattern where verbal remarks about blaming this Chinese-looking person for COVID, and then sometimes violence, or sometimes verbal violence. So it's been something that it's hit a point where I think a lot of people in East Asian cultures, our culture kind of teaches us to keep our heads down and be nice to people, follow the rules, don't and then things will get better. But there is an increasing conversation that racism in Canada is systemic and has been ever since Chinese people lived in Canada. And also, given what's happening with Black Lives Matter, the movement, a lot of Asians are kind of shifting, not just thinking about, okay, racism against Asian people exists, but how can Asians who are anti-racist be in solidarity with all people of color, and to also recognize the different layers of privilege, where I might have privilege for being in a position of power. I'm a journalist, but I might have less privilege because I'm a woman and I'm a minority. So these conversations are taking place really quickly during this global pandemic. And to me, I think it's productive because I think, like Jagdish said, it's kind of realizing there's a problem, where for a long time I would try to bring this up with friends. Like, that like when I'm going around the street, like people kind of look at me funny, or sometimes people yell at me. They would say, "Oh, that's too bad, but most Canadians aren't like that. I'm not like that. We're not as racist as like the US. So it must be just one or two people being ignorant and just ignore them." Hopefully now we're entering a moment where, with Black Lives Matter and with the anti-Asian racism during COVID, that more people are realizing there's some serious problems, and it's not just up to people of color to talk about them over and over again. I think white allies, everyone needs to be part of this conversation, part of the solution.
Thank you, Joanna. Junie, you're on mute.
Here?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
I can't see anything, but I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to, answer that question a little differently, if I may. And
Sure.
I guess because I want to answer it by starting with a quote from the late writer Toni Morrison, who says that, and I quote, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being." And so if I'm to sum up what racism looks like locally, or like, how I experience it personally and professionally, it's that it's a job to explain, and to explain that systemic racism is a problem. One of the things that I'm finding that I'm starting to object to is the fact that we have to put our trauma as Black people, as Indigenous people, as people of color, for the world to see, to prove that there's racism. And it's like, listen, it's been 500 years at least. I think by now people know what racism is. And at this point, I'd have to believe that this is just continued denial and willful obstinance from anyone who says, what is racism? I don't get it, or it's worse over there and not here. I think the issue is that we need to move to a space where we understand and we acknowledge and we admit that this is white supremacy at play. The system is functioning exactly as it's intended to function. It's not, in fact, broken. When you look at the colonial projects from here in Canada to the US to, colonial projects in the continent of Africa and India, the world over. This is well documented, you know? And so we have to understand that racism is something, as I said, that's infused in all of our structures, from government to the education system. And so what happens for us, and I'm loving that we're having this panel, but I'm reminded of a conversation that occurred on Twitter between writers who talked about the fact that in addition to being writers or other professional affiliations, there's the burden of having to also do education on racism. And while, like myself and others, we do this in addition to our professional work, but now we're also expected to talk about, explain, prove, and also solve racism. That's a lot of work and unpaid work at that. So, this is just to say that, I could go on with A to Z about the things I've experienced in terms of racism. And I think there's an important space to do that. And I'm also aware that, we have been telling people that there is racism, and we have, presented ourselves and our experiences as proof. And I don't know that we want to keep on doing that. I'm not talking about this panel per se, but just out in the world. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
It does, Junie. And maybe the other panelists can pick up on some of the points you've made. I think they're incredibly powerful points, because people don't realize the burden to educate and solve and prove again. I was having a conversation with some friends and colleagues, and they said the looks of that we're the crazy ones, that we're the ones that are something's wrong with us because we're talking about our lived daily experiences of aggression from the white gaze, how impactful that is. And so I think you brought up some really powerful points about now in this moment as well, the burden is even greater because everybody's looking to us to explain what's happening. And yet we are the ones that also have to solve it. So I'm hoping others can jump in, please, and add to what was said. I think you brought up some really great points.
I would, if I could say something, regarding, and I agree with Junie in the sense that it's been 500 years, people, I think we know what racism is. It's not difficult to identify. And it's frustrating that defense or ignorance is used as a defense by white people, we don't get it, we don't understand. But, and I wrote a column about this recently in the Star, I did take the devil's advocate position saying that, maybe there is a blind spot, maybe, for people of a certain older age cohort, or maybe people who've never really been exposed to or have always lived in these very siloed white communities, maybe there are blind spots where they really don't get it. And I tried to think about examples of where, these could exist. One of the issues, or one of the areas I came up with was education. We were talking about that right now. Junie brought that up. When Don Cherry last November railed about you people and how you come to our, more or less come to our country and you enjoy our freedoms and you drink our milk and you have our honey and all that BS, it really hit a nerve with me. And because of two things. One thing is, and first of all, it was just not true. It was completely based on ignorance. But two, because he actually, in his mind, he probably felt justified. He probably felt that he was right, that, us white settler colonial culture foundation people, we built this country, we defended it, we sacrificed for it, and all of you immigrants who are now coming here and not wearing the poppy are dishonoring what we have sacrificed to build for you. You're drinking our milk and honey. But that is completely not true, because in our own education system, had Don Cherry really known the story of the poppy, he would have understood that in Flanders Fields, in Ypres in May 1915, it wasn't just Canadian soldiers who were going through their baptism of fire. They were actually being aided and actually saved by soldiers from India. They were being saved and helped by soldiers from Morocco. There, in World War I, soldiers from China served, soldiers from parts of Africa served. And you know what? All of that history is omitted from our educational and history textbooks. And that's a consequence of a history of Eurocentrism, of British colonialism, and it's filtered through to this day, multiple generations later, and we are mostly blind to it. The look, the people who are, teaching these courses are often blind to it. The students are definitely going to be blind to it. And if we don't make those efforts to remove those blind spots, people like Don Cherry are going to get onto a national hockey telecast and continue to rail about how you people are not contributing to the freedoms that you enjoy. And so those are real problematic areas and I think that's a perfect example of systemic racism that continues to linger and persist, but it's blind to a lot of people in this country.
So I mean, Jagmeet, Jagdish, sorry, I've got Jagmeet on the mind. Jagdish, on the surface, I agree with you 100%, right? And I've been wrestling with that myself when it comes to sharing stories of the Black community in Vancouver as an example, the Chinese community in Vancouver, and of course the South Asian community in Vancouver, which is, as much as we want to share these stories, and I think they should be part of the education system, and it's a artifact of structural racism and white supremacy that isn't, those stories aren't included. I'm not sure if information is the only issue here, right? And I struggle with this constantly, because when the narratives come out, it to my mind, it puts us back into this frame of needing to prove ourselves, right? Of every community that's non-white needing to prove themselves and to draw out these rich narratives of contribution and production. And I would argue that there's also likely a lot of European history that's left out of the Canadian school curriculum as well, right? But then there's something just almost like a step behind that just doesn't recognize the humanity of anybody that isn't white, such that whatever information is shared just doesn't land the same way, right? I mean, it's and we don't need to repeat some of these tropes that get, I think, brought out many times around the lack of knowledge around First Nations community and the atrocities and genocide that was committed against them, or what happened with the South Asian community, or even with the Black community and their displacement. But those stories, as valid as they are and as important as they are, I think they're too immediately brought out as a defense and as a counter to the Don Cherrys of the world, the Terry Maluskis of the world. And in fact, it's quite often this kind of human frame, almost just a step before that, where we're just not seen in the right light. We're not even seen as, I think, human, right? And I'm not sure that anybody's ready to address that or talk about it yet. But it's this dehumanizing has happened long before the information even enters the conversation, right? And maybe that is just lack of education. I don't know. I don't have a solution for that one, but that's what I struggle with, right? And I think that's even what the struggle has been in a lot of the conversations that have been going on lately around Black Lives Matter, and even from a lot of potential allies, right? And that's been probably the most frustrating thing for me, because like I wrote an email recently to the Royal BC Museum calling them out for a statement that they put out that didn't go far enough in addressing how they were really going to tackle anti-racism internally. And a big part of my frustration with that was that the enemies are clear, right? The white supremacists that are unabashedly so, unapologetically so, they almost demand very little time from us, right? They're out there. I mean, I don't think any of us on this webinar are out there arguing with the real meathead trolls. We're not doing that, right? The frustrating and most laborious thing seems to be actually arguing with your supposed allies, right? That come in to almost sedate you when you're feeling like the rage and the anger and the heat of the moment, and you want to do something and you want to move and you want to call it out. They come in with this tranquilizer, right? To just quickly inject it and sedate you back into inertia, right? And back into a sort of complacency with the way things are, and they're good enough, or they've progressed a lot, or it's not everybody, or it's not, whatever the excuses are. And I would argue that these are people that have the information, these are people that have the knowledge and know that the stories exist, and at the very least they know what they don't know, so they can go find the stories. And I would say that the thing that's missing even there is a recognition of the humanity of anybody that isn't white. And how we fix that, I don't know, but maybe that's why we're here.
I think I can add to some of those points, because everything you both said was I found so much unpacked there. And I do feel that when it comes to being a white ally, what a lot of people just don't seem to understand is that sometimes you're not going to be welcomed with open arms and hugs and loves and kisses. by just saying that you support anti-racism as a white person. Sometimes you might face anger, or you might come across people who are frustrated and tired because you're asking questions like, what is systemic racism? Or give me one example of a time where someone was racist against you. Are you sure? Like questioning your experiences. And this happens over and over. And for people to truly be an ally, you have to realize that different people have different responses, and people of color are also very diverse. So if one person shuts you down and is just angry, that doesn't mean you get a license to give up and stop this work, because I think I share in Junie's kind of feeling that this is another panel where I'm doing for free, giving my time, and I've done so much. I have a network called New Voices, which is an international network that supports women writers on China. So that's already my big volunteer job that I devote all my spare time to. And I do have white friends or acquaintances who are messaging me saying, why aren't you responding to me? Can you explain racism to me? Like, I want to do something. And when I say there's a lot of resources online, look it up yourself, they see that as like some kind of act of hostility towards them and just kind of make it very personal. Like, I'm not doing the best I could to fight racism, which is just very, very, it's very upsetting, because we all do the work. We give our time, we give our kind of emotions, like kind of our mental health is also sacrificed in doing this work. Whereas some white allies that they call themselves give up so easily, or are so quick to judge when they encounter any emotion from a person who's been oppressed by the whole system. So really, I want to step down, and I want Junie to step down, Jagdish to step down, and some other people to rise up, because it's a social problem, and I don't think most Canadians want Canada to continue as this society where racism is deeply embedded. So people have to make changes and spend every day or once a week or doing something, right? There's a lot of recommendations online. Again, in the spirit of not doing everything for everyone, I'm not gonna list all the resources, but you can find them yourselves, like concrete actions you can take without going outside, because I am worried that in some places with COVID cases still coming up, protest is not the only route. There's a lot you can do. You can talk to your friends, you can talk to your parents. And also want to speak a little bit, because the media has come up, and I'm a member of the media, about the structural issues in media. Because when I was overseas, I was a person of Chinese descent reporting on China, so the dynamics are different. And when I came back to Canada, I started working, actually got a job in management, which is unusual off the bat in Canadian media for a person of color. But I had supervisors who recognized my potential and gave me this role of responsibility. And in the Vancouver newsroom, I was able to help steer the newsroom to cover diverse communities. And we were kind of a flagship. We discovered many stories that weren't being covered, and we broke stories, like exclusive scoops. And people realized that by reading our stories, that having a diverse team, for one, and covering diverse stories doesn't mean it's like lip service. It doesn't mean it just makes readers feel good that they're reading about this brown community or this Asian community, that is actually reflecting important things going on in our society that are being missed because Canadian media is so white. Recent survey was like 90% white, especially in positions of power, or people who are shown on TV are very, very white. But with the media industry struggling, there's another structural problems at play where some newsrooms are under pressure to hire more people of color. So in recent years, they've been really slow to do this, but my newsroom and others have been hiring more and more talented people from diverse backgrounds. But a lot of these newsrooms are union newsrooms, and they're losing money just like it's just flying out the window. So the first people who get laid off are these new hires, are these efforts that managers have made to hire more people of color. So for myself, I was sort of demoted. I was a bureau chief of the Vancouver newsroom for the Toronto Star, but because the paper lost so much money, they had to shut down or downsize a lot of these bureaus. So now I'm a journalist, a reporter, because there are no management positions across Canada. We're all reporting to Toronto because we don't have the resources to lead our own newsrooms. So I feel that that's something else that people who consider themselves allies could do. If you see an and newspaper or magazine outlet really doing a good job telling you stories and promoting journalists who are people of color and diverse backgrounds, which also includes different class backgrounds and physical disabilities, then you can support them, because without funding for media, which is seen by, it's where we engage with society, then I think it's going to be hard to go forward, because these people aren't being, they don't have jobs, basically. There's many, many laid off young journalists of color in Canada who could make really great contributions if they were given opportunities.
I just want to go into our second question because I want to give time for Q&A, and we do have quite a few questions ready to go. But I think it connects to a little bit of what everybody is saying around challenging what allyship means, and really also looking at ourselves within our own communities and how that reflects what is happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. Because I really do feel Black Lives Matter and what's happening in the US has provided a platform and a kind of calibration of where we are looking at white supremacy and these systemic issues that we see living and breathing around us. Every step we take, we confront this. So I'd like us to think about how we can regionalize and localize the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-racist revolution taking place in the USA and around the world. How do we regionalize it within our spaces, within our professions? I think we want to do something tangible, and I don't want this movement to die down. I feel like a lot of people are just hoping it's going to fizzle away, and therefore, you know, the movement will die down. Our capacity to be as bold as so many people are becoming is going to die down. So what do we do to keep it regionalized and localized and going?
So, I mean, I've got a couple of ideas there, and they're a little uncomfortable. And I think, you know, as a person of color, and making sure that we tease apart and understand the complexity of how different my experience is from a Black person's experience in North America, let alone Vancouver, is to recognize it in ourselves first, right? You know, there's anti-Blackness within myself, because if we're looking out at society like that, we can't look at society without saying, I grew up in this media environment, I grew up in this society, I've been programmed the same as somebody else. It's up to me to find my own programming first. Second to that is kind of moving to, I think, our most immediate circles, right? And one thing that's been really challenging, and I've been getting this weird, you know, like masochistic pleasure out of, is again turning to the allies, right? Of helping the allies reorient their empathies and their appreciation of humanity back towards the people that are most marginalized and most oppressed in our society, right? Because I know people with very big hearts, right? They got a lot of love to give. Unfortunately, it's all going to police officers, it's going to the RCMP, it's going to the pre-existing authority structures. And the thing is, if we leave everything alone, those authority structures, they will survive. They'll be fine. The RCMP's been here killing people for a century. They'll keep doing it. They're going to be, you know, they're doing their thing. And I think the challenge is to, you know, talk to our families, talk to these local institutions of power, whether it's your local city hall, whether it's our cultural institutions, and taking them to task and holding them accountable to not just put out these very sort of placid, tepid, you know, letters saying, oh, well, you know, we believe, you know, in all of humanity and everybody's got a right to live, and, you know, but actually saying, you know, we're racist, right? And we believe that structural racism exists within our four walls, and we're going to work to fight it, right? And few and far between are the institutions that are willing to do that. And then as far as I think the general public and the allies are concerned, white allies especially, is helping them reorient their empathies towards the people that need it most, right? Because everything that is in support of police, I mean, again, hey, you know, some of my closest friends are police officers, right? It's nothing against the police, but they're not in need of our empathies and our humanity right now, right? There's another population that is, historically, right? And you know, one of the most frustrating things in this has been actually looking at how much resistance you get trying to reorient somebody's empathies and their humanity towards the communities that need it, and then realizing that they're able to pontificate, they're able to kind of, you know, wax philosophical and you know, sort of dabble in these hypotheticals, because they've got no skin in the game, right? They've got nothing at stake. So as a white person in this society, you have nothing at stake. And so you're able to fully just pontificate about, you know, what side is right, what isn't. Oh, well, there's two sides to every story, etc. I've heard so much of that, right? And so much support of police systems where it's like, it's because you don't have anything at stake that you're able to do that. And so I think locally, what we need to do is just go to our allies, reorient their empathies, and then attack our institutions that are within, you know, a stone's throw, and say, what are you doing here right now to make sure that this doesn't take root here?
I think that's great, and I wanted to extend on that, if I may. What I guess one of the things that's concerning is that, you know, we're getting people wanting to do something. I want to help. I want to, like, what do I want to, you know, how can I participate in this movement? And I don't know who to credit for this comment, but I want to say that for me, myself personally, I would like for us, particularly those who are not in these communities, to move from the concept of allyship and to a concept of accomplice, because we can see a lot of performative allyship happening. You put a square on your Instagram or Facebook or whatever social media. You can talk about your outrage about this, that, and the other, but that in fact does zero, right? And so people get to feel comfortable saying that I sent that, you know, I sent that tweet out about my outrage. I sent a, you know, and it's not to say that these things aren't useful. We need all ways of addressing this systemic problem. But the issue that I see is that first of all, in our communities, Black, Indigenous, South Asian, all of it, we, as you've said, we have to do some homework. We need to look at our biases and prejudices and sort out our backyards. We really do. Because what's happening is in this moment is where, if all of us were aligned and understand that this system needs to go, and that we need to work together, this is the time to do this. And we can't get bogged down with, you know, the white supremacist way of divide and conquer, you know. And you see it. We see people from our very own communities spouting the rhetoric of this system, and you're like, what is going on? For us, it's Candace Owens. For others, who else? You know, we know those names of people who are just not serving our communities. But we need, as communities impacted by the colonial ongoing project of resource extraction, of going to other countries and doing all of this stuff, and, you know, the ongoing genocide of Indigenous folks as we speak, we need to be on top of it and in line. And what we need is accomplices. We cannot have people who say, I'm an ally and I want to help you, because that might mean, you know, armchair activism. Again, that's useful to a certain extent, but I need to know, if I'm marching down the street about, you know, potentially defunding the police, abolishing prison, or all of these things that are harmful to all our communities, we can't be about just being an ally on the weekends. The discomfort that we feel, particularly allies, that's on allies to sort out, or accomplices, I should say. So I want us to hold our acquaintances, the systems, the white folks who are in positions of power, to a degree of accounting, to hold them accountable, and hold the bar way higher. The bar is too low for what's expected from allies. And so, in my opinion, if we're expecting anything from folks, it really needs to be, we're an accomplice. We're here to work alongside you to dismantle this system. And the last thing I want to say is that we need to be done with reform. And I mean reform on anything. Because if we can look at the history of anything 500 years ago to now, we should be able to say it was never enough. All of the changes are never enough. If we are still here talking about this, it's not enough. And my firm belief is that reformist conversations are about keeping us quiet, giving us crumbs to be okay with what we get until the next egregious thing. And we can't keep going through this cycle. I think we can acknowledge and note that this system is BS. It doesn't work. We can't work with this system, and we need to be working to dismantle it. Point blank.
I just have a small point to add to that, which is there's like 2 points. One is that I believe that we're done telling stories, like listing all of the times that we've been hurt and in a systematic way. But also on the other hand, I was trying to, before this panel, look for some information on like the whiteness of Canadian media and the, the system of whiteness in Canadian media. I really couldn't find that much information. Like surveys are really old, like 20 years old in some cases. So I think what accomplices can do is to look into what data we have and to help gather this data, because as a journalist, I can't advocate what you do with the data, but I know that some activists use this information and write to their MPs or approach people in government in positions of power, or people who are leading organizations of influence, like newspapers, community organizations. You show them this is what exactly you did wrong, for example, and this is how you can improve. For example, like something very small you can do. Say you have a favorite magazine, but you feel that despite how much you like it as analysis, it seems like they mostly run white columnists. So as a reader, you can count in a week. You ran columns, 97 were white men. And I think that's one way to really get people to pay attention, because like Mo said, or Jagdish, people of color often are seen as kind of crazy and like we're making it up. But having this kind of facts in your face, it's kind of hard for people to ignore. So that's one tactic that accomplices and people in anti-racist community maybe can devote. Because myself, I wasn't able to find this data in journalism. There might be more data available, say in policing, whether there's data on how police might target Indigenous women, for example, more than women of other ethnicities. So that's one thing. So into other suggestions as well.
I would, if I could just sort of quickly, I know we're probably running out of time here, but like, I would say that to Junie's point, like, the idea of being an accomplice and aiding that struggle, it definitely is appealing. As people who, all of us are people of color, and we've all experienced racism to different degrees. But there are a couple of subtle points here I think we need to kind of be very clear about. I think we have to be clear about that anti-Blackness is different than the racism that people of South Asian or Chinese origin experience. And even between South Asian and Chinese, those are probably very different experiences of racism. Anti-Blackness goes back 500 years, and that it's a staggering number, and it's kind of it's a little bit too big to get our heads around. It goes into the whole era of slavery, which again is
Jagdish, anti-Blackness goes back centuries.
Yeah, I mean,
scientific racism, enlightenment, it goes back centuries.
Well, far, and but those are very different racism experiences, and so, and not only does it like find there's sort of this whole white world out there that needs to be educated and brought to heel and kind of recognize the humanity of people of color, people who are Black, people who are Indigenous, but I think within our own communities we can be accomplices by stopping the anti-Blackness in our own communities. Like within the South Asian community, I can't speak to others, but within the South Asian community, there's plenty of anti-Blackness. There's plenty of like anti-Black racism and all kinds of silly memes and dumb jokes and all kinds of stereotypes that just keep filtering down generation to generation. And if we really, before I start marching with Junie and others and here in Vancouver, like I have to confess, I don't know very many Black people, just partly because it's not a very big population. Whereas when I was in Toronto for a couple of years, I knew plenty of people from that community. And so my experiences here are very different with the Black community. And so before I can even consider marching and working, side by side and, providing help, I think I have to kind of do community work within my own South Asian community in terms of, these ideas that continue to filter from generation to generation.
I think that's a really important point, self-reflection. And, Junie mentioned something about, this moment of our communities we need to come together. And I'm talking about Black, Indigenous people of color. And part of that coming together is to dismantle our own selves and anti-Blackness and casteism within our own selves. And, pushing back against the conversations in our households that say, "O goria, sonia," meaning she's white, she's pretty, right? Like, we have to combat these languages within our very small spaces. That's our regional spaces, like Mo was talking to. We only have a few more minutes left, and I want to get to a couple of questions. There's some really great questions. One of my favorite is, can you give examples of how you decenter the center? And, I've been hearing this question a lot, and it's burdensome to have to think about that question. It's a burden. And I want people to understand how much of a burden it is to even wrap your head around such a big question, and the fact that we have to be the ones to come up with the answers. But regardless, the people in this room, all of you are amazing. So how do you decenter the center?
I'll take a crack at that question. I mean, I think especially for people in positions of power, it's literally stepping aside, I just witnessed something that happened on Twitter, and while it wasn't necessarily started by white folks, or I believe McLean's was holding a discussion with some Black writers and community activists, and the panel was all Black men. Somebody posted on Twitter, you couldn't find a Black woman, and the moderator was supposed to be white. I don't know what happened, but quietly the panel looked different. The discussion was moderated by Desmond Cole. Some of you may be familiar with his work. And so some themselves off the panel in order to make that space. So this can be, in your workplace, in other spaces. If you look around and you see that you are the center, and so we're not talking about performatively giving up power. This is actually, in fact, for real giving up power, centering others and removing yourself from the center.
So I just wanted to add to that. I think media, again, plays a really big role in providing a picture of what's normal to people. So as journalists, if you're in the media or you have influence over the media, you can make sure that the stories you're writing, people you're quoting, reflect the diversity in Canada and your communities. A simple way to do that is to access one of many excellent experts directories. A lot of groups, including my own, New Voices for the China world, have put together lists of female and minority experts on a huge range of subject areas. I think a stereotype is that Asians only know about Asian subjects, or women only know about women's issues, but minorities know about everything, are experts, but are often not platformed. So I think when media makes sure, and also events like this, conferences, they're using these directories of experts to present diverse people, like faces. I think that makes a big difference in decentering the center, because when you open a magazine and it's all white faces looking back at you, even as a person of color, you kind of have a little bit of a self-hatred. You think of yourself as not normal or not part of the mainstream. And that has to be dismantled with every single decision people of influence make, who you talk to, who you invite. And if you're the one being asked to do something, stepping down, like Junie said, it has to be an everyday action and habit.
Yeah, I mean, for this issue of decentering the center, like it's, for the last 20 years, and even going back a little bit further, there was this concept of affirmative action. We need to start hiring and bringing in people of color into boardrooms and into like different companies and corporations and give them an opportunity, because they were either denied or, through other historical reasons, they weren't able to kind of come to these higher positions in management or what have you. And, that came with all kinds of other baggage, and that came with all kinds of other pushback. But I think, sometimes decentering the center requires just sometimes really fundamental structural changes. And an example I was just looking at today was, in 2018 in Vancouver, the city municipal elections, Vancouver once again elected an all-white city council, and there was another it was another white mayor. I mean, in Vancouver, there's been 40 mayors since the incorporation in 1886, and all 40 have been white men. And 98% have been of the councillors have been white as well. And so you would look at this question and think to yourself, you know what? According to this pattern, how can you possibly change this? And we could talk about education, we could talk about anti-racism and workshops and whatnot. But I think there's a real fundamental structural shift of just changing the at-large voting system in the city of Vancouver and making it into a ward system. And if you run wards in Vancouver, you will suddenly find that instead of having to push for equity hires and affirmative action, you will naturally get a diverse slate of candidates rising up into council positions. You won't need to go down this other road, which is so fraught with all kinds of pushback. So sometimes that decentering the center and having other diverse faces into the center and getting more diverse faces into the center requires subtle but significant structural shifts.
Somebody just posted saying, when are we going to stop thinking of the center as the center? Like, when are we going to stop looking to the center as the center? And I thought that was really significant. But anyways, Mo, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've vacillated on both sides of that. Like, I worked in arts and culture and produced a festival in Vancouver for years. That was one of these quote unquote multicultural festivals. And I look back to that with some embarrassment for a good 6-7 years of it, because I feel like we were trying to impress the center, right? We were trying to fit in and be accepted by this sort of cabal of white arts organizations. And then later on, the activity was more kind of in resistance to the center, right? But the center was always there, right? And I think it's really tough to ignore when you're not able to displace or express power sufficiently, right? Or provide some sort of alternative. Like, one of my best stories to tell is attending Afropunk in Johannesburg 2 years ago. And there's a festival that was a celebration of Black community power and a very Black centrist sort of voice. It's not even Black centrist, it just was, right? It felt like being in Wakanda or something. It was incredible. And there was such an access to power, and there was such a unity in that event and that sort of cultural expression. I think the only way to sort of not stop thinking of the center as the center is to have such a powerful alternative, such that we're able to kind of create our own centers of influence, right? Our own spheres of influence. And I think we have to be real. I mean, for any brown kid that grew up in this area, that's the whole reason we were attracted to hip hop, right? Growing up, it's because you look out into the world, you look into the music and culture that is mainstream, and as much as you might appreciate white music by white bands and white performers, you kind of gravitated towards the Black performers, right? And why? That was the most powerful structure that you could access, that was close to representing you, that was in opposition to the same thing that you were perhaps feeling a little oppressed by, maybe subconsciously, right? And I think that continues to be the underlying reason for the popularity of hip hop with people of color, is that it gives us access to power, and we owe a huge debt to all the Black creators for giving us this, right? Especially in diaspora, when we didn't necessarily have the critical mass to produce that level of power and generate that level of power for ourselves. So I think the day that culturally, socially, politically, economically, we are generating power that gives us an alternative to what we today call the center, that day the center will stop being the center.
I know I'm looking at the time. Yeah, Joanna, go ahead.
I have to leave now. I have a bunch of babies arriving at my house. So this has been amazing. And I'm on Twitter if anyone wants to reach out and ask any questions. Thank you for
Thank you, Joanna.
Right,
I would like to give Junie the last word, if possible. Junie, just I'm getting messages from friends saying, what a powerhouse. And it's not lightly that we say that. We are drawn to your what you're saying because people people are afraid to say this. People are afraid to look at their own institutions they're working in and name people and call out people and say, you're racist, you're racist, you're racist. And so if you don't mind, we didn't plan this. I would love for you to have the last word. It's yours.
Okay. Gosh, I guess it's just to reiterate that we certainly have a lot of work to do with our communities, in our communities that we're in, and across communities. And I know it will be a long and painful road. That's the thing. So, you know, questions of how to decenter, how do we move forward? All of these, I'm saying this in terms of like when I hear that question, particularly from white folks, what I'm actually hearing, and I could be wrong, is how can I do this expeditiously as possible and with as little pain as possible? And I'm here to tell you that there is no way you're going to do this work, that you can do this work without extreme discomfort. For white people, you're going to be a race traitor. Your white friends, your white family, they will not like you speaking up. You may find that you lose opportunities, and I'm not saying that that's okay. I'm also saying, what I'm saying is balancing that, looking at what our communities, or let me step back. The consequence of racism, of structural racism, of discrimination, of this white supremacist state is that we, as Black, Indigenous, people of color, do not get to live to our full potential. We do not get to breathe and be and exist. We are existing in this structure in a way that the fact that we're surviving is testament to our community's resilience. But what we need to move forward is for people to pick up on that work, because we're exhausted. You know, we're tired, we're hurt, we're grieving, and it looks different for different communities, you know. But what we need to do is to work together to find a way to be accomplices and to move forward at dismantling the structure. We can't continue this way. If this is in fact the actual revolution, I'm here for it. I hope everyone else is here for it, and that you're not just scrolling idly by through Instagram, but that you're either on the streets, you're challenging your city councilors, you are speaking out, you are deciding to write that op-ed in the paper. You know, I attended this thing called Informed Opinions, where they did a quick workshop on how to actually write a 700-word opinion piece for the paper and pitch it. And I recommend that if anyone has that opportunity to do that, because we are drowning in everybody else's discussions about what they think is best for our communities. And we need to be able to speak up. You know, and that's that. I think we're in for the long haul. This is a marathon. It's not a race. And, you know, 3 weeks in for New York City and Black Lives Matter. And so we need to be able to do that and not be kumbaya about it. We cannot be going to the art gallery or to wherever where people are smoking weed and, like, you know, playing music and thinking that we've now addressed racism. We haven't. So yeah, this is the hard work. This is where it begins.
Thank you, Junie.
Thank you.
Oh no, thank you. You know, it's only an hour-long panel we got, and I think we managed to really give incredible thought and provocative thought in what everybody contributed in this very short panel. It has been recorded, and we are going to make this available for people who want to listen and watch. And yeah, let's challenge each other to act and call out their municipal representatives, call out people within their universities, call out people within their workplaces, call out people in the media. Let's challenge, let's keep doing it and be unafraid. Because I don't think anybody can touch us, frankly. My feeling is. Anyways, thank you, Mo. Thank you, Jagdish. Thank you, Junie. It was a pleasure. And thank you to all our attendees. Have a good evening, everybody.